Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 15. Era fell through the warp gate with wild swings of her knife, and a vicious snarl edged deep across her face. The only thing holding back the tide of "Wall is closing in," and I can't go back," was the fact that she didn't know of anyone in Phoenix with a warping quirk that worked quite like this. And that anyone who knew her, knew what she was and what she could do, would have killed her while her guard was down and transported her unconscious body. As it was, she would pay back her kidnapper's lack of foresight with blood and pain and a bitter stream of curses. Darkness still clouded her vision, but Era felt her knife catch on soft flesh as she stumbled forward, hearing cries of pain and the squelch of gore when she ripped her blade through anything that came too close.
"Kurogiri, why does she have a knife?"
A voice whined, childish petulance tempered by something harsh and rasping.
"I thought this was just a low-level NPC."
Blinking the shadows from her eyes, Era whirled around on the speaker with a vicious snarl and found herself face to face with a hand man? Villains. She fucking hated villains. "If you don't know who I am," she spat, drawing her bloodied weapon close, "then I suggest you let me go before you realize your mistake."
Ugh, she's so annoying. I hate it when they talk like that.
Era bristled at how he spoke, not to her, but about her. But she settled herself and stole a moment to see where she'd been transported. A large, empty warehouse greeted her. Arching above and around her into inky blackness, through which she could barely make out countless figures, roaming restless at the fringes of sight. Closer, and more easily visible, was the circle of people around her, keeping a wary distance from the threatening glint of her knife. And, of course, the only man who had spoken. Lanky, ashen-faced, bedraggled pale blue hair that was kept out of his face by the large hand that enveloped most of the front of his head. Blazing red eyes stared out from between the corpse-like fingers. And for a moment, Era felt a lurch in her stomach, before she quickly snuffed out the weakness. Behind him, she could see the culprit of the warp gate himself, tall and wraith-like. The listless smoke that made up his body neatly tucked into a suit vest and slacks.
"You should drop the knife, child,"
said the Smoke Man, stepping forward.
"Cooperate and you will not be harmed."
"You're in control. You make the pain stop."
"Fuck you," Era ground out through clenched teeth. "Fucking make me. Or are you a bunch of cowards?"
"Kurogiri!"
The man with far too many hands whined, turning towards the man with the warp quirk. Kurogiri, then. She'd remember that.
"This one's so much work. Can't we just kill it and get another one?"
"I'd like to see you try, motherfucker," muttered Era beneath her breath, eyes darting around at shifting movement in her periphery. Shit, this was going to get ugly.
"Shigaraki Tomura,"
said Kurogiri almost chidingly, as if lightly scolding a child for drawing on the walls.
"There is a schedule to keep."
Shigaraki, another name to remember, another fucking name. And the fact that they were letting them slip so readily meant that they either didn't think her much of a threat, or they thought she'd be dead long before she could make use of the knowledge. Shigaraki reached up to scratch vigorously at his neck.
Nervous tick.
Eric quickly catalogued that as well.
Fine,
he sighed, hands dropping limply to his sides once more.
But we'll need to tie her up or something. I can't have her stabbing my followers.
I'm right here, Era snapped. Talk to me or get the fuck out of my face.
You cannot escape.
Kurogiri let thin tendrils of shadowy mist drift from his form to emphasize his point.
You will only end up exactly where you began.
And if you keep pissing me off, you'll regret it.
A thin smile spread across Shigaraki's face like a sickness. An Era repressed a shudder.
Do you want to know what my quirk is?
Not particularly. Slowly sweeping her leg behind her, Era shifted her weight and adjusted her grip on the knife. Sorry to break it to you guys, but I'm not so great at doing what I'm told. Era lunged backwards, sinking her blade deep into the shoulder of the unfortunate thug closest to her, just as a blast of electricity passed through where she had been standing moments before. Twisting the knife deeper, she pushed off from the man and knocked him to the ground, leaping across the dusty floor with another swing of her knife that caught against the hardened skin of a mutant Quirk. She gritted her teeth at the impact as tremors ran through her bone, but kept a firm grip on the handle, wrenching it free and ducking between another swing. It was chaos, thrashing arms and flailing legs, and wild quirks that were just as likely to hit another villain as they were to hit her. A grin began to spread across Era's face as she slid across the warehouse floor, slicing the back of some poor unfortunate's calf and leaving him howling on the ground as she slid between his legs. These men were just a bunch of street thugs, poorly trained and lacking in discipline. If she could press the element of surprise, she might actually stand a chance at escape.
No move.
There was no time to react. One moment Era was scrambling to her feet, making a break for the exit. The next, she was slammed into the ground, arms pinned to her side as her ribs creaked and snapped at the impact. She struggled, and the vice-like grip tightened around her, further splintering her bones and driving the air from her lungs with an involuntary groan of pain.
Don't play too rough, Nomu. We need her alive.
Oh, that could not be good. Nothing pleasant ever came from needing someone alive.
Better than dead,
supplied an unhelpful voice in the back of her mind, as whatever was currently crushing her to death loosened its grip ever so slightly.
Right?
No. No, that was wrong. At least with death, there was an end, a destination. Alive meant things would only continue. On the bright side, they didn't know her quirk. Era managed to swallow the pained noises rising up in her throat as the creature holding her down, the Nomu, lifted her up like a lifeless doll and gracelessly set her down in a cold, metal chair. If she could hide the extent of her injuries, then there would be no suspicion when they all magically healed. They didn't know her quirk, so that meant they really didn't know who she was. What she was. Era clung to that fact, let it soothe her, even as the Nomu pinned her arms tightly to her sides in the chair. Even as another thug approached her with a roll of duct tape, and she kicked out viciously. Even as the Nomu's grip tightened further, and she found she couldn't fucking breathe.
They don't know what I am.
So they weren't here for her. Unfortunately, that left a lot of unknown variables. And Era had never been keen on working in the dark. If this beast was going to grind her ribs into splinters every time she so much as twitched, then she'd have to settle for leveling Shigaraki with a blistering glare that carved itself into the lines of her face, teeth bared and stained crimson with her own blood. Not that he seemed to care. Fucker. Era resisted the urge to struggle as they wrapped the duct tape around her legs, restricting her movement and threatening to cut off her circulation. Snarling, Era's hand curled into fist against her sides, nails digging into the meat of her palms, when the hulking creature behind her released one of her arms. Immediately, her forearm was dragged behind the cool metal back of the chair. The other soon following, as tape wound its way around both of her wrists, clinging to the skin uncomfortably, and forcing her hands to splay out at awkward angles.
There. Much better. You can step back now, Nomu,
said Shigaraki, reaching up to scratch at his neck again. Era craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever it was that had pinned her down with one hand, but she couldn't quite twist around far enough. All she knew was that he was huge, strong, and his hands, at least, were covered in gnarled, inky black skin. "What exactly is your plan here?" she asked, through the blood pooling in her mouth. Villains like to talk. They liked it when you were forced to listen. Era didn't know what she was holding out for, but odds were a hero was going to get involved eventually. Hopefully, she'd still be in one piece by the time that happened. "What do you hope to accomplish by kidnapping a high schooler?"
A UA high schooler.
That can't be good.
So, she was being targeted for her school, specifically. Were they trying to go after the heroes who worked there? Lure them in? Or perhaps they wanted to prey on the next generation, to teach them a lesson, and break their spirits before they'd even begun. "I'm a general studies student, not hero course. You sure you got the right kid?"
Don't question me.
Shigaraki's mood turned in a flash of spitting rage, fingers scrabbling at his neck more furiously than before.
I know what I'm doing.
"Do you?" Era pressed him, despite a lurching twist in her gut that advised her not to piss off the clearly unstable villain who had somehow amassed an army of followers. "Care to elaborate?"
We're going to kill All Might,
he crowed with a vicious smile.
We're going to bring this broken society to its knees.
This was a lot. Okay?
Okay?
He repeated, taken aback.
What do you mean, okay?
Well, typically that's a word used to indicate acceptance, or maybe in this case, understanding.
Shut up,
Shigaraki snapped, taking a step forward. Era resisted the urge to shrink back in her chair.
I don't like you.
Yeah, I'm getting that impression. Don't worry, I tend to have that effect on people. You're not special. Oh, that was the wrong thing to say. Era barely managed to keep herself from flinching as Shigaraki slammed his hand into the metal right next to her head. Fingers flying close enough to her face that she could feel a sharp sting where a nail had dragged across her cheek. She didn't turn to look, keeping her gaze level with Shigaraki as he leaned over her, the hand covering his face almost brushing against her own.
What did you say?
He hissed, and Era wrinkled her nose at the warm puff of air that ghosted across her face, as well as the overwhelming stench of formaldehyde that she assumed was seeping from the dismembered hands arranged across his body. That was a shame. She'd really been hoping those were fake. I said, Era cocked her head, finding his eyes and refusing to break her gaze, that you're nothing special. The moment hung in breathless stillness, neither blinking as they stared each other down. Era with a cool indifference from where she sat tied to an uncomfortable metal chair, and Shigaraki with a writhing anger that only intensified the longer he loomed over her. Then, just as suddenly as he burst into seething rage, a wide grin cracked through his pale face. He cackled, and Era struggled to maintain her composure, as she felt the hand by her head shift towards her.
You're just a dumb NPC like everyone else. You don't matter. We're going to kill All Might, and you're going to help us. This is your chance to actually mean something. Isn't that exciting?
Yeah, I'm fucking shaking with anticipation. How exactly do you expect me to help you?
Keep him talking. Keep him talking.
The hand had lifted from the chair, but though she could see the flicker of its movement out of the corner of her eye, she didn't dare turn to check.
You're going to be a hostage,
said Shigaraki cheerfully. Again, not a Hero Course student. All Might doesn't even teach me. I highly doubt he knows who I am, or would come looking for me if I went missing.
No one would look for me. I'm alone.
Era gritted her teeth against the thought in a firm dismissal.
It's better that way.
Shigaraki shook his head, the smile never leaving his face.
Doesn't matter. We've got a way into UA, so we can take you to him. He'll take one look at his helpless little student and know that he has failed. I want him to suffer before I kill him.
Cool. Again, not his student.
You go to UA. You're still his responsibility. You'll still die under his watch.
Great. So they did plan to kill her. That she could work with. Why not one of his own students, then? Someone in the Hero Course? In his class?
Someone who would be missed.
Shigaraki huffed, and Era's arm twitched as a finger brushed against it.
Too much trouble. We needed someone easy to pick up the streets. The general studies kids have weaker quirks.
Okay, that smarts a little, said Era breezily. Why me?
You ask a lot of questions.
I'm a curious person, Era shrugged. Can't help it. Though I assume it has something to do with where I live. Kurogiri piped up from a little ways back, and Era's eyes darted up to acknowledge him before they returned to Shigaraki.
Your neighborhood is far less patrolled. Criminal activity is less scrutinized, and even expected.
Well, that's what she got for choosing this shitty side of town, she supposed.
My turn,
hissed Shigaraki.
What were you doing wandering around so late? You were supposed to get to your apartment hours ago. Kurogiri's been waiting all night.
None of your business.
No fair.
A couple fingers dug into her upper arm painfully.
I answered your questions.
This isn't a game we're playing, said Era, turning her voice cool and steely. It's not my fault if you're an oversharer, but here, since you're so interested, I'll give you some advice for your trouble. You picked the wrong kid. No one cares about me. No one will miss me when I'm gone. I have no friends in or outside of class. I've little to no interaction with the teaching staff of UA, and honestly, I don't particularly care for All Might either way. You've kidnapped a nobody. I'm not a hostage. I'm just a deadweight. She laughed joylessly, felt it twist to sharp edges as it rattled in her lungs. In short, your plan sucks. If they killed her now, she could escape and warn someone, anyone, of what was about to happen. Maybe she'd get lucky, and there wouldn't be too many questions about how she'd gotten away. Or maybe she'd just have to cut and run. But either way, it would be better than letting this insane villain and his countless lackeys try and kill All Might. Not that she really thought they could, honestly. Sure, anything was possible. But she'd managed to take these guys on pretty easily, even while outnumbered. The only one who posed the threat was that Nomu guy, but even so, if they had figured out how to infiltrate UA, then students would be at risk. Her classmates.
Children.
She would not allow it. If you really want it to hurt, you should pick a different student and try again. But honestly, I feel like you're all wasting your time. You barely managed to kidnap me, a first-year general studies student, and you think you can take down the #1 hero? Not to mention the countless other pros at UA? You're either stupid or insane, and I'm leaning towards the former. You want to send a message? Good luck with that. It's gonna be a little tough from a jail cell. Silence. It was unsettling. Era had expected him to fly into a rage again, to spit and snarl and quickly end her life in its fury. But instead he was simmering. Restless, hot anger blazing like embers in his eyes. A hand coming up to scratch so furiously at his neck that it left dried flecks of blood beneath his fingertips. But he did not strike. "You," he said at last, sucking breaths between clenched teeth. "You are annoying. That's okay, though. You think All Might won't care about you? Maybe we'll make him care then. He's always been soft. I think seeing any child already bloodied would twist the knife, don't you?" Oh fuck. Oh fuck. This was the exact opposite of what she needed to happen. "Are you listening to me?" said Era hotly, pushing back the desperation, trying to edge its way into her voice. "They won't care about me. Wipe the board and try again with a different kid." No, I think this'll work just fine." The smile had returned in full force, twisting his face into a monstrous reflection of joy. "That's the funny thing about hostages. They don't need to be in one piece. They just need to be alive. Isn't that right, Kurogiri?"
Be careful, Shigaraki,
said Kurogiri gently, as if they were discussing what breakfast he should eat, instead of whether or not they should fucking torture her. Fucking hell.
We have limited time. We don't want to set ourselves back. Be careful, Shigaraki.
"I'm not stupid,"
Shigaraki said with a scowl, and Era felt a few fingers tighten around her arm once more.
"I'm right, aren't I? What? Is she going to miss a few fingers? An arm? We're going to kill her anyway."
Keep him talking. Keep him talking. But what could she say? He was right. She'd fucked up, and now she was going to pay the price. To suffer for her failure, just as she should. If she'd just been smarter, faster, better, then she would have been able to avoid this.
You control the pain, little bird. You make it stop.
No, she couldn't spiral. Not now. There was still work to be done. "Idiot," she snapped, ignoring how Shigaraki's glare burned into her skin. "Unless you have a very impressive medical facility hidden away in this little man cave of yours, relieving me of my fingers will kill me before you get to UA." That was a lie, and a risky one, considering who she was talking to. Out of anyone, villains should know what would and wouldn't kill a person. Even someone without a healing quirk would be able to survive whatever blood loss came with a missing finger. Shigaraki laughed again, a sound that grated her ears like scratching tires on asphalt.
"You'll be alive for when we get to the USJ. That's all we need. I asked you before if you would like to know my quirk."
Yes, and I distinctly recall being uninterested. Era didn't flinch as Shigaraki reached for her face with his other hand, digging his fingers into her skin and forcing her to look over at him. Only 4 fingers, she noted for the first time. 4 points of pressure twisting at her face, and at her arm too. Though he was crushing her battered bones with his grip, he delicately held his ring finger apart from the rest, to keep it from touching her skin. Touch-based quirk, her mind supplied unhelpfully.
You're a mouthy brat. I think a demonstration would do you good. Watch closely.
Era could only breathe and stare across at her arm as he gleefully set his fifth finger down. For a breathless moment, there was nothing, and Era thought that maybe, just maybe, the universe had decided to throw her a bone and deactivate everyone's quirk for the day. That it would just be her, a sociopath, and whatever tools he could scrounge up in the meantime. Because that would be a known variable, something she understood and could anticipate, endure, overcome. Throwing quirks into the equation made it so much more difficult to keep her composure. Then there was the itching, burning sensation spreading out from the tips of his fingers where they dug deep into her skin. Like an unpleasant rash or a mild chemical burn. Uncomfortable, but not painful. Still he was grinning madly. One hand tightly wrapped around her face and forcing her to watch whatever it was that would happen. Surely he wanted her to panic, to scream and writhe like the insect he clearly thought she was. Era would not give him the satisfaction. Thin lines began to spiderweb across her upper arm from the points of contact. Cracks that split and shattered across existing scars, until bits of skin began to flake away into specks of dust that... The pain hit her. A gasp of breath stuck itself into Era's throat, until she managed to trap it behind clenched teeth. Her body twitching towards an aching spasm, before she forced herself to still. Burning, simmering, ripping, tearing. Era failed to find a proper point of comparison. The closest she could think of was fire, licking up her arm and searing deep into the flesh to leave specks of ashy nothings where she used to be. A white-hot brand twisting into her skin because...
You control the pain, little bird.
And Buck. But maybe it was knives, cruel and dull and sliding past meat and sinew, to carve and cut and cleave. Era breathed through her nose in carefully measured gasps, not trusting herself to open her mouth, lest the lid be thrown off the weakness barely contained within her, leaving it to fly loose with cries and sobs that would rack her body. She would not, could not, give him the satisfaction. Then her quirk kicked in, and a new agony vied for her attention against the burning, melting, slicing, writhing maggots beneath her skin, bits of flesh hastily weaving themselves together, even as they faded away, even as they reformed in strands of twisting, squirming sinew, even as they turned to dust once more, again and again and again.
Kurogiri, what did you say her quirk was supposed to be?
Past the fog of pain and can't give him the satisfaction. She could just barely make out Shigaraki's voice. It was as if she heard him from a great distance, though she knew he must be close to her ear.
Physical enhancement. Just a mild strength quirk.
He hummed, and it reverberated through her aching skull, forcing her eyes closed with a stifled hiss of pain as he pressed his finger harder against her flesh.
She's resisting it somehow.
There wasn't anger in his voice, or frustration. It was more glee, amusement. The excitement of a child having found a new toy to smash into little bits.
It's kind of funny. Look, she's twitching like a little bug.
Buck, you. White-hot anger warred with the churning agony, and her eyes flashed open to seek him out and force her rage upon him. A sharp burst of pain at her lip, and the metallic taste of fresh blood overwhelmed her senses once more. Ah. Can't give him the satisfaction. Of course, that would have consequences. Always consequences. If she had to chew through her entire lip to keep herself from screaming, then that's what she would do. If only to wipe the smug grin from this asshole's face. Even past the excruciating pain of his quirk dancing across her own, she still had the presence of mind to know that showing weakness here would be inexcusable. At last, Era managed the unruly corners of her mind and let herself drift, felt the pain become not dull, but distant, inconsequential, something outside of her control and not worth her concern. Slipping into that state had taken far too long, but she could berate herself for that later. Perhaps it was yet another skill that needed practice. She felt herself shudder, Shigaraki's grip tightening around her arm with little bursts of heat at the sudden movement. That kind of practice would not be pleasant. Her head began to loll to the side, and she let it. What did it matter, with Shigaraki holding her in place? It wasn't as if she could move. There was only one rule here. Don't give him the satisfaction. Everything else was negotiable. Shigaraki withdrew, and Era's head drooped in earnest before snapping back to attention once more. She blinked her eyes rapidly to clear them of that unfocused haze. Someone was talking, but there was cotton in her ears. Too far. Gritting her teeth, she leaned over to spit some of the blood flooding her mouth onto the dusty floor. God, she really was weak. Had she really slipped so far into her days that she couldn't break free of it? Pathetic.
Perhaps the physical augmentation also provides some level of resistance alongside strength.
Kurogiri's voice drifted into her consciousness in tattered strands.
It appears that your quirk was having some effect, even if it wasn't so instantaneous.
What does it matter? She's annoying, but she's fun to take apart. Like a puzzle box. I wish she would scream. That would make it so much more fun.
Again, there is a schedule to keep. There are still preparations to be made, and the time draws ever closer.
Shigaraki let out a snarl of frustration, and Era blarily saw him reach up to scratch at his neck once more.
Fine, but I think I want to keep this one. I want to see how long it would take to turn her into ash.
Yikes, thought Era dryly, pain-drenched wooziness clinging to her like persistent cobwebs. Tuning out their conversation, Era brought her attention to the damage at her arm. It was already healing. The uncomfortable writhing sensation beneath her skin told her that much. But there was definitely a sluggishness to her quirk that suggested it had been worked to the bone. To the bone. A grin tugged at her lips, one that she steadfastly dismissed. Not the time. Even if it was a little funny, skin and sinew crumbling away and all. Everything ached in a gangrenous kind of way, the decayed edges of nerves firing back to life, and painful sparks of rekindled awareness. The closest sensation she could recall would be how she felt after burning to death. Sickly, dulled, rotting from the inside out. Worse, this time, for reasons she couldn't quite pinpoint. Maybe it was the way her skin cracked and flaked away like paper or glass. Maybe it was a residual feeling of brittle frailty lingering in her bones. She wasn't keen on experiencing it again either way, and she didn't think it a weakness to be thankful for their distraction. Clearly, they were planning something big, if it required them to divert their attention elsewhere, with so many lackeys around to do the grunt work. Something big and something soon. They still didn't know her quirk, so that was another point in her favor. Hopefully, the blood welling up around her wounds and drenching the edges of her tattered clothing would hide the extent of her recovery. Era breathed, twisting her hands around from within their bindings. Even though duct tape was a little trickier than handcuffs, she was certain that she'd be able to slip out of it with a few snapped bones. That wasn't the issue, though, was it? The real barrier to escape was the warp villain, Kurogiri, and the ever-looming Nomu, silent in the shadows, unseen but for the occasional flicker of movement in her periphery. Fine then. They'd have it their way. Era allowed herself a grin through her gritted teeth. If they so desperately wanted her as a hostage, then they could have her. But if they thought she'd just sit by like a meek, helpless, good little general education student and let them wreak havoc on her fellow students, those children, then, well, let them think you weak and destroy them for it. They had another thing coming. End of chapter 15.